I welcome all the dignitaries who are present online to attend today's talk. This is the third talk in the series. Dr. R. Venkateswaran is the Senior Vice President in Persistent System Limited, Pune. He has joined Persistent Systems in 2002 and has undertaken various roles during his tenure, including Chief Technological Officer, Head of Strategic Initiatives, and Business Head for the Telecom business. Prior to Persistent, he worked for 7 years as a researcher at Bell Laboratories and also at the CTO office at Lucent Technologies. Dr. Venkateswaran is BTech and MTech in Computer Science from IIT Bombay. He completed his PhD in Computer Science from Washington State University, and he holds multiple patents in the area of ATM multicasting and had authored numerous research papers that have been published in prestigious journals. Without wasting or taking much time, I would like to invite Dr. R. Venkateswaran to start his talk. Thank you, sir. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Shukla, for the kind words of introduction. I'll share my screen and good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. Usually this is conducted better in a more interactive forum, face-to-face, but given the situation that we are in, we are doing this remotely. I don't know how well that would work out, but I hope we can still have a more very meaningful session today. I'd like to still keep it very interactive, so please do type any questions you may have during the course of the today's presentation. What I'm going to cover today is how do we write a good research paper. And before I start, let me take a moment to really acknowledge various sources from where I have used material. So what I'm really presenting here is not something very unique. It's just that I have collected a lot of good thoughts from different sources, and I'm presenting that to you all today. Many of these points probably you all know. You have been researchers for several years, so it's not going to be something very different from what you know. But I hope that there will be one or two points that you will probably get in today's presentation that you can use to improve your overall quality of the research paper going forward. Specifically, I would like to thank Professor Henning Schulrings, his write-up, which has been very useful in helping me to create the material for today. So let me start with, what does it take to write a research paper? So before we do that, the first question that typically we need to ask is, why are we really writing a paper, right? So there are many reasons. Different people have different motivation for doing it. Of course, the top 2 or 3 reasons would be that, yes, you are doing some interesting research work. You found some good, interesting results, and you want to share that with the research fraternity, right? We all learn a lot by sharing. We learn a lot by reading other people's work. So in that same interest, if we share what we have learned, others can benefit from it, right? So it is basically giving back to the research community. The other is, of course, to build a good peer network of like-minded individuals, people who are working in similar research areas. You can now would be very interested in reading about what you do, and you can create a good network of such individuals. And these kinds of interactions with the like-minded individuals is always very, very enriching and rewarding, and it is beneficial to both. Right? The other reason is that, okay, you want to help other researchers to further their research. So you have, through the course of your research, you have found some things, you have learned from mistakes. It is good to just share some of those things, right? What are the mistakes that happened? What were your learnings? So that others don't have to repeat the same mistake. They can use your work to progress further. Right? So they can take advantage of all the experiments and the findings that you have come up with and move their research further. Right? And we also do the same, right? It's not, we move our research further by reading other people's work, and therefore it's in that interest we are sharing, right? Obviously, because of this, it enables collaborative work. And then last but not the least, writing research paper helps you to establish your credibility, right? You become recognized as an expert in a particular research area, right? And that's why we write research papers. So these are all various reasons why you would want to do. Now, before you start writing a paper, of course, you need to kind of pick up a topic for it. And how do you go about picking the topic? Of course, the easiest way is to say, well, let me pick up the most, the most popular hot topic of the day. While that may not always be the right thing to do, right? Because the area that is hot today may not be that relevant, say, 2 years down the line. So it's always good to pick an area that you are passionate about. When you are passionate about a particular area, you will always spend that extra effort to go that extra mile, right? And that's a very, very important requirement when you're doing research. That what is it that you are passionate about, so that naturally you are able to put in your efforts and go that extra mile. And that's what differentiates between a good researcher and a mediocre researcher. Right? Of course, while area of passion is important, it's also important that it is an area of active research, because you don't want to be doing research where nobody else is working, because that also means that you will not be able to get a whole lot of benefit from the research community or the research fraternity. So when you work in areas where there is active research going on, then it helps you to interact with them, read what others are doing, and it obviously helps as a very good motivating factor that can also accelerate your work, because you can build up from what others are doing as well. Right? So how do you go about finding which are the areas of active research? One easy way to do it is, look at some of the, and today Google is very helpful in all these things. Find top colleges that are working on that particular topic of your interest, and find that research groups that are working in that area. And you can read about, what are the publications there, what are the other researchers doing. So you get to kind of get a feel for, what's happening in that particular area. And it is very important to keep yourselves current in terms of more recent publications. More often than not, again, some of these are my experiences. I'm not saying that, the audience here everybody does it. But by and large, what I've found is that many a time the research is based on certain publications that are at least 5 to 10 years old. In research, as you all know, it's very important to stay current. So if you are not reading papers that are in the last 12 months to 18 months, then you may not be very current in that particular research area. Again, just to brush up the basics, you may want to go to some of the earlier papers, but it's very important to keep yourself abreast on what's happening by reading more recent research publications. And this also gives you ideas for where to focus your attention, right? For potential focus areas and so on. Right? So this is how you pick up a research topic. Now, assuming that yes, you have done this, you have done your research, you've got some good results. So then you start thinking about the process of really writing up the research book. So the first question that comes to mind is, who are you really writing the paper for? Sometimes it may happen that you may be writing the paper not for a publication in a journal or a conference. It may just be you're writing it because you want to kind of crystallize your thoughts. So the audience may be may not be an academic audience. It may be more of a layman kind of an audience. So you have to be clear about who you're writing the paper. Then you need to focus on how do you keep the reader engaged, right? Starting from the very first section in your paper to the end of the paper. How do you keep the audience engaged? How do you tell a story which is all about your research? It's not always a good idea to write, very deep technical stuff right in the beginning, because not everyone, all the readers may be fully familiar with the research area. So it's always good to have a nice story that goes from the first to the end. Okay? Now, of course, if you're going to publish it in a conference or a journal, then there are writing guidelines, and it's always good to just stick to the guidelines. You don't want to deviate from it, because that would be an immediate reason why your paper may not get accepted for publication, right? So it's always good to stick to the writing guidelines and organize the paper accordingly, right? The title, the abstract, the introduction, then of course your contribution, and then the conclusions and so on. So this is a structure that is, most conferences will kind of go with this structure. So it's good to just stick to it. My general belief is that writing a research paper is an art, and it's an art, and it can be learned to practice. So the more you practice, the better it is. Okay. So how do you go about writing a good research paper, right? So what is it that a good paper really accomplishes? One, it has to be very clear about what the paper is all about. Okay. It's a clear statement of the problem. And more important is, while the problem statement, what are other researchers who have done on that problem before, right? Once you've kind of explained or given a context to the problem, and the reason for doing this is because if you don't do that, then the reader may not really, who's not familiar with the area, may not know what exactly your contribution is. Then of course, once you have talked about, established a context, then you need to talk about, what you have done, what is your new contribution, and what are the results that you have achieved. Right? So that kind of constitutes what a good research paper is all about. Right? So clear, very, very clear articulation of the problem, talking about what has been done and what is your contribution. Now, if you're going to look at it that way, then what should this proposed solution, what is it that when you say your new contribution really mean? Right? A new contribution means it has to be something, especially in the area of, you're writing it in the area of computer science, maybe it's something new algorithm, which is significantly different from what others have done. Right? If you just change one or two parameters, then it doesn't become a significantly different algorithm. Right? Or it could be a new design, right? It could be a hardware or a software design, or it could even be a protocol design, right? Which is more practical, pragmatic way of doing things. Right? Third way to talk about your solution could be that, okay, you have may not be something new, but you have done a very thorough performance evaluation of a different set of methods that the researchers have been doing. So you do a very large number of experiments and talk about, or simulations, and talk about, analyze them, measure them. It's like a performance evaluation kind of a paper. And last but not the least could be something very, very theoretical, which is talking about a very specific area where you have identified a new way of looking at the problem. You have come up with a hypothesis or a theory, and you kind of want to articulate it, right? So these are, again, saying these very generically, but this is where most of the new solutions or new contributions would be centered around this, right? Again, just from my experience, and I'm sure many of you who review papers also probably would have come across, right? Many times the contribution doesn't come across very clearly. It's always an articulation of what others have done, which is great. But then unless there is significant contribution, then it doesn't warrant to be a very good research paper. Okay? All right. Moving on, what else should this thing? Of course, once you have talked about all these things, then you have to basically provide all the details. You have to provide all the results in sufficient detail so that somebody else who is reading the paper can really re-establish whatever you have, your results that have come. Right? So the validity of your results have to be repeatable. Others should be able to kind of reproduce. If that is not possible, then your contribution gets questioned, right? So that's a very important part, that you describe the results in sufficient detail so that other researchers can establish that, yes, what you have achieved is something significant, right? It's very important to highlight what is new on the result, right? The novelty part of it. And especially if it is non-obvious. See, sometimes you will say, okay, this is a linear curve. When you plot X and Y, you say X and Y are linearly related, right? It may be very obvious. Then it doesn't really warrant to call it out and saying, what, X is directly correlated to Y. But on the other hand, if it is non-obvious, then it becomes very important to highlight that, right? And last but not the least, it's very important to also kind of say what does your results really signify, and what are the improvements, what are the impact of those results. All that is very important to kind of highlight. Okay. Then comes the next part of it, that okay, you are looking at your paper. How do you make sure that your paper is read by a wider audience, right? And usually this can be accomplished by making sure that you talk about all the lessons that you learned, right? Because the paper is just a culmination of several months of hard work, right? And if you are able to kind of outline all the hard work that you have done, and the lessons that you have learned through that hard work, it's very that makes it very important. Then others can benefit from it, so that they don't repeat the mistakes. That also implies that many other people will also read your paper, so your paper becomes widely referenced, right? If you can provide a lot of details that others can replicate, then again, because others are replicating your work becomes the seminal work, and there will be a lot of referenceable. Others are going. A lot of other researchers are going to reference you. And last but not the least, when you present your results, always present what else can be done. What are the areas of future work? What are the areas that you have not focused on? You can give some pointers on or guidance to others where they could focus on. Right? That also means that when the other researchers do their work, they will use your work as a base, which means your papers get referenced more. Right? So these are the small tricks that you can use to get your paper work to be widely referenced. Okay, before I go further, talk about how do you decide your title and so on. Let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions. How do we write a title? Right? Because title is the first thing that is read by the reader, and the title has to be exciting, right? It has to be brief. It has to be descriptive about the research work. It can't be very vague and mysterious. It kind of talks about what the research work is, and it has to sound exciting. It should not be very boring. Right? It's many a time we make this mistake of talking about using superfluous words like something which is best or something which is novel. Now, if it is not new or if it is not novel, you're not going to really be publishing, right? So by saying a new algorithm for or whatever, it doesn't really make sense. Just say algorithm for is good enough, right? As long as we are able to create that excitement and describe the research work in the title itself to the extent possible, that itself will bring in a lot of interest. Right? And it's a very different difficult task. Right? How do you balance between being very specific about the research versus specific enough to excite the audience? And that's a very very subjective task here. And by experience, of course, one picks up, but it's a very nice way that if you're able to kind of convey the meaning, being specific enough that people want to read, at the same time not giving everything away in the title, it makes it very, it will enthuse the audience to read more, right? So using of different kinds of adjectives will kind of help to describe what you've done, makes this, this fine balance, right? So as an example, right, I mean, let me kind of take you to, if you see a title like this for a movie title, right? We all know what this movie is all about, right? I'm sure this movie is not going to be about some thriller or something like that, correct? Just by looking at the title, you can kind of figure out, okay, this is what the movie is about. And if you're interested in that kind of movies, you would probably go and watch it. Or something like this, right? So these are the ways in which the title makes it very obvious as to kind of what the work is about, at the same time exciting enough for the reader to go and read. So some tips for how to choose the title. One, of course, you have to provide some hint about what the content is about. It's very important to do that. Keep the title interesting, as we have seen in some of the movie titles here. Make it, make the reader want to read the paper. You have to obviously have, it has to reflect what the tone is. If the title is, very formal, then obviously the paper is expected to be formal. If the title is very, informal, then the paper is expected to be written for the layman with an informal language, right? And if it has important keywords, then it helps you to do the keyword search. And when people do keyword searches, then your papers show up in the Google search, right? So it's a very important part to make sure that certain keywords that are relevant to the paper are part of the title. Okay? So let me share some examples of what would look like, right? So again, I picked a title so that it appeals to a wider audience. So if you see a title like this, so why do past? I mean, this is a very simple title, right? And you're talking, obviously, when somebody reads a title like this, you know what the author is going to write a paper about, right? And given the simple terminology used, it's also obvious that this paper is probably going to be a very informal way in which it is going to be written, right, for a more general audience rather than for an academic audience. On the other hand, the same title, if it's written in this way, right, it talks about this looks a little bit more academic. At the same time, of course, looks very unnecessarily. It looks very wordy, right? It kind of takes a very simple idea and makes it sound very complex, which the paper may not really be. Right? So again, a very fine way to look at it. Is it going to the other extreme? You have to be careful about that. Now, this may be a very simple way of writing the same thing, but at the same time, kind of conveying the tone that this is for a more academic audience and not for a layman, right? Because you see these words like stellar and scintillation. It's not words that people use in common, common communication discussions, right? It means that it's typically intended for an academic audience, right? So again, these are just examples of some titles that help you to decide, or help when you read it, you kind of get a feel, okay, what the paper is about, what the author wants to convey, and in general, the tone of the paper. And of course, if this topic is of interest to you, obviously you'll be motivated. Moving on to the next part, once you have written the title, then comes the abstract. The abstract is a very, very key part. Again, comes in the very beginning of the paper, so most readers would read it. And what an abstract conveys is the summary of the paper. Right? Again, so if you're talking about the entire paper, you have to summarize this whole thing in whatever the number of word limit prescribed by the publication, right? So you should talk about, what the problem statement is, what is the context to that problem statement, provide that so that the reader who is not familiar with the research area gets an idea. Again, you can't write very long context, it has to be brief, but it kind of gives an idea of what this paper is about, right? It should convey some part of the results, maybe not the entire thing, but it should convey the highlights of the result in such a way that it excites the reader to read the entire paper, right? And very important as to why the reader should read that paper. It has to indicate that, right? So you could say, you found this result, or your algorithm performs, in less time. You got a 30% improvement in the accuracy of your predictions, whatever it is, right? So there are many ways in which you can kind of convey the result so that you can kind of indicate why this paper is worth it, right? And of course, all while sticking to the 150 to 200 words. That's typically the word limit that you get, right? So let me give an example of two abstracts and kind of let you go through. I'll pause for a minute here and let you read this. See, if you see the left side, and I'll also show the right side at the same time, so you kind of get a feel for how these abstracts have been written, right? And then we'll spend a minute on which one is what is the first one, the left one and the right one kind of communicate. Okay? So I'll pause for about 15 maybe 30 seconds for you to kind of read this, and then I'll kind of give a context to it. Okay, so if you got a chance to go through it, right? So let's see the left abstract. The left side pretty much talks about, again, the title is the same. It's just that how are they writing the abstract for the same title, right? So obviously it is about intrusion detection. So it's about security, it's neural nets, it's fuzzy logic, right? So it's a very interesting topic, right? So title kind of makes the reader to say, okay, well, let me go read what this is about, right? The left side kind of gives if you see the way it is written, right, it's very difficult to figure out, what exactly has the author done, right? The researcher, what are the results that all it says is, in this work, we have used a novel type of neural networks to combine it with a fuzzy logic classifier. Okay, so something they have done, but why is this exciting? What are the results that they got from doing this is not mentioned anywhere. So it doesn't kind of motivate the reader to read further. And it just says, very vaguely, it says, it will improve the state of the art. I mean, what is the state of the art? How does it improve? There are no quantified way in which there's a lot of hand waving, subjectivity that comes into the left side of the abstract that is written on the left. Now, let's compare that with the abstract that is written on the right. Now, here they talk about very specific detail about what all exactly they did, right? So they talk about, how they normalize the file names, what kind of vectors they use, what kind of algorithms they use, what tools they used, and what kind of classifiers they used, and what are the results, right? So everything is now put in the abstract. Now, as compared to the left one, obviously, it makes it a lot more meaningful, but at the same time, it also kind of discloses everything in abstract itself. Now, if you disclose everything, it's like, a mystery novel, right? If you tell if you're talking about a murder mystery, if you tell who committed the murder in the abstract itself, then nobody wants to read that novel, right? It's the same thing. If you tell exactly what you've done, nobody's going to read the paper to find out, what exactly, right? And if the objective of your writing the paper is that people want the audience to read your paper, then keep that, that mystery factor alive, right? Keep certain things for the paper. Right? So kind of disclose only what is required, what keeps the audience interested to continue reading the paper. Okay? So that's kind of gives you a contrast of, one extreme and the other extreme, and where you need to kind of be in between them. Now we have talked about, writing the, so what are some do's and don'ts? Of course, just to reiterate, you do have to provide your context, you highlight your work, your results, and of course, stay within the specified limit. And what you try to avoid is ambiguity, try to avoid general motivational statement, right? For example, many people, they just bring in some random stuff like, this, our work aligns with, whatever, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, whatever it is, right? Well, it may be important, but typically those are motivational statements best left unsaid in these kind of contexts. Okay? And as far as possible, don't mention references or mathematical equation. Leave it to the main paper, and don't go into too many details in the abstract itself, because you want to keep the audience engaged, right? And typically, the abstract is written after you have written the entire paper. Okay? So with that, moving on to the next section, which is the introduction. So how do you provide a good introduction, right? The introduction is about introducing the problem, right? So you have to provide a context. You have to talk about the general area in which the problem comes in, and as much detail as possible you have to provide, and why it is an important area that you are working in it, and you want the reader to kind of continue working or read the paper, right? It's a very important part of writing the introduction, right? And introduction, of course, once you have provided the context, you also are going to talk about the general approach that others have taken, and what is the specific approach that you're taking. Again, without disclosing all the details, you have to give a good guideline of what your approach is and what your contributions are. So very much like the abstract, the introduction is the very first section most people read, and it has to be interesting enough for the reader to continue reading to the rest of the paper, right? So you have to give a general approach of what others are doing and what you are doing and what your contributions are, right? And it has to set the expectations for the rest of the paper. Okay? Because when you talk about your contribution, say that, I have achieved this result, and you explain that in the introduction, people will feel motivated to read. Right? If you don't talk about it, then people get turned off, right? And if they get turned off, they may not read the paper, or they may not read the paper in the right spirit. So it's very important that the introduction kind of addresses all these things. And very more often than not, what we've seen is that the abstract and the introduction kind of overlap quite a bit. And please avoid doing that. As far as possible, keep the abstract very, very crisp, and the introduction reasonably elaborate, and try not to repeat the same sentences from the abstract in the introduction. You can say the same things, but word it differently so that it reads different, and it provides a more elaborate way in which you are kind of establishing the context of the problem. Okay. So basically what the introduction kind of talks about is what you really want to say in the paper. Right? It gives the entire context to the paper. Okay. Some people I'm sure would have heard this, right? Most reviewers read the title, abstract, intro, and maybe the conclusions, and then they decide whether the paper is an accept or a reject. While that is not a fair way to talk about evaluators. But yes, in some sense, first impressions are formed when you read the introduction and the abstract and the introduction, right? So it's very important to keep the introduction interesting so that the reader continue or the evaluator continues to read them. Okay. So typically we also see that in the introduction there is one paragraph at the end which talks about like what the rest of the paper is going to talk about. Right? It's like a table of contents. Again, while it's a good thing to kind of establish what is coming in the rest of the paper, it's an again play a little bit with the words here, be a little bit more flexible. So the left side, if you see an example that talks about exactly what the section 1, section 2, section 3, and so on and so forth is going to cover, right? And it's very, very monotonous, right? It doesn't interest the reader. On the other hand, kind of play a little bit with the words, talk about what you're contributing in different sections. Kind of again, it conveys the same meaning, but it makes it a lot more interesting to you. Okay. Now coming to the main part of the paper, right? So now that you have done your abstract and the introduction, written the nice title, let's talk about what the main paper should be. Main paper again should be you should be very clear about what you're writing the paper for. What you are going to say is very important. You have to be very clear about that. Many a time people write the paper and then at the end of the paper you don't even know what the author was really wanted to convey. Right? It's very important to kind of say what you're trying to say and before you start writing. This again, it's a little bit of a debatable idea. What is the right kind of voice to use while writing the paper? Should one use an active voice or a passive voice? In general, it is found that active voice is a lot more easier to read and understand. So preference is towards active voice. Again, different people have different opinions on this, but passive voice tends to be a lot more impersonal and formal, considered to be less friendly. And it typically becomes a little bit more wordy. So it becomes difficult to understand what is being said, especially when you have long sentences. So as far as possible, kind of state what you're doing in an active voice. For example, you would say, we performed the research or we performed the experiment, rather than this experiment was done by us, and the longer statement, right? So it makes it much more easy. And within a section, try to keep consistent. If you're going to use an active voice, keep it consistent in that particular section at least. Maybe different sections you could use different active voice, passive voice, depending on how you want to say it. But as far as possible, try to keep it consistent. Having said that, sometimes it's also interesting to use two different voices in this, one after the other, just to bring out a contrast. As an example here, right? So if you see the first sentence is in passive voice, the second is in an active voice, right? Kind of brings a good contrast and makes it very interesting. Okay. So whatever I'm talking about here are general guidelines. Try to follow them to the extent possible. But of course, be a little bit creative here. Like I said, it's an art. So you can be creative. You can mix and match a couple of things, just like, any other creative field. Try to mix and match a little bit, and you'll find that, your paper reads much more, sounds much more interesting than for the reader than if you write it in a very pre-established way of doing it. This is another very important thing is people try to write long sentences and it's very difficult to parse and figure out, what is being said. So in general, it's always a good idea to keep sentences short and simple and have 3 sentences if required to say the same thing rather than, writing all of it in one long sentence, because it's easier to convey what you want to say in simpler sentences. Okay? And be very straight and crisp, right? Don't have to kind of beat around the bush. You don't want to do, I'll talk about some of the examples of, these filler words and so on. Right? So strong, concise sentences are very effective and try as much as possible to use those, right? And in a paragraph, one sentence follows the other. So there has to be a very good linking of thoughts. It should not be that, you are talking 5 different things in 5 different sentences in the same paragraph. Try to create a story. Like I said, this is a story. You want to make sure that, every sentence is there because it is connecting to the previous sentence and connecting to the next sentence. Right? And if that sentence is looking out of place, there is no reason to have that sentence. You can pretty much eliminate it. And again, You will never get it right in the first attempt. You have to read, reread, and iterate multiple times to get your actual paper written. Right? If you're talking about a new thought, always start with a new paragraph, so that kind of gives a break in idea, saying, okay, I talked about some things. Now I'm going to talk about something very different. So let me take a new paragraph to talk about, or a new section to talk about. Right? And as far as possible, avoid parentheses, brackets to talk about, some of the providing a context in brackets. Try as much as possible to avoid. Okay. If it is important to provide that kind of a context, there is this concept of footnotes. You can use footnotes to kind of bring that up, right? So you don't have to put parentheses and make your sentences long, right? And more important is this filler words, right? So let me talk about what filler words are. So some examples of filler words. Many times we try to use this, right? Again, we all use it. So I'm not in any way saying that, I'm holier than thou or whatever. We use it. We use things like, absolutely, completely. I completely agree with you, or I absolutely agree with you. There's no reason to say that, right? The agree with the theory is as clear as possible. By putting in 1 degree of absolutely agree has no, doesn't convey anything additional, right? Similarly, we add things like due to the fact, or has the ability, or it's important to know, needless to say. So these are some unnecessary fillers that we add to kind of make the sentence long. Those are better avoided, so that your sentences are short and crisp. So needless to say, the project will end. I mean, why is it needless to say? The project is ending tomorrow. Just say project will end tomorrow, right? Convey it very, very simplicity, as brief as possible, as concise as possible, as crisp as possible. As long as it conveys the meaning, we are done. We don't need to add additional words to just, unless it is kind of tying with the previous idea, right? So you have to kind of say, okay, if you're tying, for example, the project will end tomorrow, if it is related to the previous thought, then you kind of say, okay, consequently, the project will end tomorrow, or something like that. So you're now tying two ideas together. So fillers are needed only to tie ideas together. By itself, fillers are unnecessary in many cases. Now, moving on to the once you've written the main part, now is the key part is the experimental result, right? You have written your paper, you have performed experiments. Now you're going to communicate the results, right? So very important to highlight, why you perform the experiment. What was the goal of the experiment? So if you have some theoretical assertions in the paper, you're saying that your work is, 30% improvement on somebody else's work. So you are going to perform an experiment with that somebody else's work and your work, and you're going to compare the two, right? So the goal of the experiment has to be very clearly stated. What you did, how did you do it? What were the tools you used? Very important to kind of highlight this. Again, be judicious. You don't have to go down to, I used a Windows 10 machine or whatever. It may not be that relevant, unless, that is very important for replicating the results. Otherwise, you can just say, I use these certain tools, and, MATLAB was used, or, some plotting tools were used to plot the results. You may give some context to it, and certain libraries that were used. For example, if you use TensorFlow in your machine learning algorithms, you kind of highlight those so that the results the reader can kind of use those to replicate the results. It's extremely important that the results should be replicable. If others cannot replicate your results, your own results are then questioned, right? Did you really achieve those the results? It becomes a very questionable, then your credibility becomes questioned, right? So it's important to make sure that what you do is you are very rigorous in kind of capturing all this, all the critical parameters, and highlighting those in the paper, right? Sometimes people use, perform the experiment once, twice, maybe 5 times, and then say, well, the experiment is performed and, the results are conclusive. Usually for experimental results, to make it conclusive, you have to perform the experiments a number of times with different parameters and still get similar results so that it is statistically significant. Okay? People who are well versed with statistics will understand what it means, right? So it's very important to make sure that the experiments are performed as many number of times, so it becomes very credible. Your results are a lot more meaningful rather than just running the experiment once or twice and drawing conclusions from that. Right? If there are tables and graphs, they make a lot more sense than writing about it in verbose text. And if you already have a table, don't try to explain the table in verbose text. For example, many times people say that, they write x values 10, y values 20, and say for value of x, 20 was obtained. I mean, that is very obvious on the table, right? So you don't have to write about it. Only highlight the non-obvious, non-intuitive results that came out and your insights of the result, rather than talking about the exact numbers that are already there in the table. Right? When you plot a graph, it's very important to talk about the statistical confidence, because your experiments are never going to be an exact replica of your theory. There will always be statistical errors, and there will be deviations. So estimates of those errors and estimate of the statistical confidence is very important to include. Right? Always explain the significance of the result. Rather than saying it's a straight line, talk about what it means when x and y, there is a straight line between x and y. What does that correlation imply? And again, if it is obvious, don't have to state it. But if it is non-obvious, do highlight the non-intuitive results. And if there is anything surprising or you found very interesting, and if you're able to explain why it is, that makes your paper a lot more readable and a lot more credible. And last but not the least, your experiment obviously is going to have limitations. You would have done it on ideally you may want to do it with 1,000 machines. You may have done it in a lab with 10 machines, and you're extrapolating it. So talk about it. Talk about the limitations. Talk about it. That makes you, the reader, kind of believe in you, right? Nobody expects that your work is perfect. But if the reader believes what you've achieved, half the battle is won, right? So that's the whole idea. Try to be honest to yourself and talk about, what are the, limitations of your experiment as well. Then last is the conclusion. Conclusion usually summarizes the paper. Again, the only difference between abstract and conclusion is abstract comes at the beginning, so you're not going to disclose the secret sauce. But in some conclusion, you've typically done the work, you've already talked about it. So conclusion can kind of highlight all the results in as much detail as possible, right? So you are going to disclose the key contributions, your result, and more important is to suggest the areas for further research, right? And as far as possible, keep the conclusion specific to your result. Don't extrapolate and draw conclusions which are not there, right? You may have done the experiment, and don't kind of extra stretch the truth a little bit. I mean, some extent, yes, but not a whole lot, right? And more, inferences at the end of the day are your interpretation. Somebody coming from a different perspective may interpret the same result differently. So be open to it. So that's why you can't kind of forcibly say, this is the only possible conclusion or whatever like that, right? Many times people write that. It's not always the case. Unless you're 100% sure, even there, you have to be a little leave room for, other people interpreting it differently. So kind of say that, okay, you found strong evidence to conclude what you're concluding, or to infer what you're inferring, and not kind of, close the door there. Keep it open for somebody else to interpret it differently. Okay. So that part forms the conclusion section. Now I'll kind of talk a little bit about how do evaluators, and many of you are also evaluators, how do they read the paper, right? So think about it this way. Evaluators read a lot of papers when they're evaluating your paper along with many others, right? So your paper should stand out. So how do you make the paper stand out? So usually the paper, when evaluators read it, they typically do 3 passes, right? The very first pass is a very high level cursory reading, right? Just read the title, abstract, conclusion. And with that, they kind of get a sense of, what this paper is about, right? And if those 3 parts, I said that it is not fair, but usually that's what happens, right? Evaluators do it, right? They form their first opinion based on these 3 things, right? So if those are interesting, then the second pass comes in, or they've already made up their mind. I'm not saying evaluators will pass a judgment based on the first pass, but they're coming into the second pass with a prejudiced view of what your paper is about. So that's why it's very important, keep the title, abstract, and conclusion very interesting. The second pass is where the reader, the evaluator, kind of goes through the paper in all its gory details, understands the contributions, make sure that, what are the areas that they feel there are gaps that have not been addressed. Is the paper saying the right things? Does it mean what has been written? Sometimes you may mean something, but you may write something else. So all those things are done during the second pass, right? But the detailed proofs, detailed findings are kind of left usually you don't read in the second pass. You just assume that, okay, somebody has written a proof, that proof would be mathematically correct. Right? In the second pass, you don't do that. You just look at the result and say, okay, does this kind of intuitively make sense? Right? Does this paper kind of convey what it wants to convey? The third pass is when the proofs are read. If there are any inaccuracies in the proof, there are some assumptions that are relevant for the proof to be valid. All those things get reviewed at that point in the third pass. Right? Once all this is done, as an evaluator, it's very important that you kind of provide a very detailed review. I have been part of many committees where the evaluator kind of writes a paper and just says accepted or rejected. It doesn't make any sense. It's very important as a researcher to help your fellow researcher out by writing a detailed reason for why you came to a decision, both accept as well as reject. What you liked about the paper is very important because that reinforces a good behavior that the researcher would want to continue. If you didn't like the paper and rejecting it because it was too, it doesn't meet the criteria, be very objective about it, write all the right reasons. By just saying not appropriate or keeping it very vague, it doesn't give any feedback to the writer. So it's very important that the authors will benefit from all the time and effort that you spend in doing a review. Okay? And it doesn't matter what the final decision is, the author should be able to benefit from the review. Sometimes they learn more from the reviews than from the actual decision itself. Then there are tips I have for how to present. So maybe in the interest of time, I'll probably not go through this for now. I'll open it up for question answers. Just summarize what I talked about. So what I talked about is about writing a research paper being, it's an art that can be mastered with practice. There are small nuances that you can pay attention to when you write the next paper. I'm not saying that you're not publishing. Every one of you is a researcher. You have been publishing good work. It's just that there may be certain parts that you can pay attention to the next time that you write. To improve your writing skills, it's very important that you read more. The more you read, the more your writing improves because you're able to kind of assimilate how others are expressing their thoughts. In today's world, it's completely unacceptable that you have typos and grammatical errors in your writing. There are lots of spell checkers and grammar checkers available today, online tools, offline tools. Please use them. It takes 5 minutes to do it, but it conveys a sense of your responsibility that, okay, at least your paper is grammatically and typographically correct. Many times it happens that, especially if English is not your mother tongue, is not your first language, sometimes the grammatical errors creep in. But it's important to just make sure that these are addressed before it is submitted for any publication. Right? This is something that I find very useful. Your supervisor who's kind of reading your paper is obviously aligned with what you're thinking because you have thought through, or you have discussed many of the ideas with your supervisor throughout the preparation of your research, right? So they are biased. Again, I mean it in a very positive way. Right? They're also inclined to your way of thinking. It's always good to seek somebody's suggestion who brings in a very different perspective, because your reader is going to be somebody who's going to have a different perspective. So seek out somebody who can be a mentor, right? Not necessarily a supervisor. And more important is, seek a mentor who will kind of review your work, give you guidance on, what worked, what does not work, all that. And the mentor has to be somebody who is very honest and upfront. He's not kind of saying things just to please you, right? You have to be very clear about that, right? And mentors are somebody who will watch, who are here to, they are your well-wishers. They are here to help you progress, right? Like I said, many times, the first writing is never the best one. You have to iterate multiple times, sometimes 10 times, 15 times to get it right. Till you are satisfied, don't kind of shortchange this. There is no shortcuts here. Writing the paper, reading it objectively, rewriting it, making corrections, making sure every sentence that you put in there is relevant. Irrelevant sentences are not there. All that is very, very important. That happens only when you iterate multiple times. And the first version is never the best one. First version is just to get your thoughts in. Then you iterate and iterate to improve your paper. Okay? Criticism is very valuable. Take it positively. It is not about you. It is about the paper. It is about the expression of your thoughts. It doesn't in any way talk about you as a researcher. You are a very good researcher, but the paper is probably not bringing all the right points in the way it is articulated. So be open to criticism, especially from your reviewers. Try to incorporate those, because that is what makes a paper better and better every time. Last but not the least, what you write in your paper, it comes your passion for that area comes across through your paper, because that's the window that you're providing to the reader. So if you are passionate about your work, it shows in your research, it shows in your writing. So if you're passionate, obviously the results will show. Okay. So that's all I had to say. So thank you again to everyone for being a patient listener. Thank you very much, sir, for considering me for this and giving me this opportunity. And I appreciate everyone who was joined the call today for your time. And feel free to write to me with your suggestions. It will always help me improve my session going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.